The coffee pot slipped from Eliza's trembling hands, shattering across the saloon floor. She stared at the mess, her vision blurring with exhaustion. 3 days. That's how long it had been since she'd eaten a proper meal. The owner of the Red Creek Saloon, Mr. Hutchins, had been forgetting to pay her wages for 2 weeks now, and her room at the boarding house was due tomorrow morning. "Clean that up, girl, and it's coming out of what I owe you," Hutchins barked from behind the bar, his yellowed teeth showing in what he probably thought was a smile. Eliza dropped to her knees, picking up the larger shards with shaking fingers. The room spun slightly. She'd fainted once already this morning, in the storage room where no one could see. Around her, the afternoon crowd of miners and ranch hands barely noticed her struggle. To them, she was just another piece of furniture in this God-forsaken town at the edge of the Montana wilderness. Before I continue with Eliza's story, I'd love to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and give this video a like. It really means a lot to us and motivates us to bring you more quality content like this. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from? Are you at home, on a drive, or maybe getting some work done? Let me know in the comments. The saloon door crashed open with such force that the hinges groaned in protest. Every conversation died. Even old Pete stopped mid-deal with his poker hand frozen in the air. Eliza looked up from the floor, still holding a jagged piece of porcelain, and felt her breath catch in her throat. The man who entered wasn't just tall, he was massive. 6.5 feet of solid muscle, packed into worn buckskin and a heavy fur-lined coat that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His hair was long, dark as a raven's wing, tied back with a strip of leather. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw or the scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone. His eyes, pale gray like a winter storm, swept across the room with the wariness of a wolf entering unfamiliar territory. "Mountain Man," someone whispered. The name rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Everyone in Red Creek knew of him, though few had ever seen him up close. Thomas Kane. He lived alone in the high country, only coming down to town 4 or 5 times a year to trade furs and buy supplies. Stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd fought a grizzly with just a knife and won. Others claimed he'd been a soldier who'd seen too much war and couldn't stand the company of people anymore. What everyone agreed on was that he was dangerous, unpredictable, and best left alone. Thomas moved through the suddenly silent room like a force of nature, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. Men twice his age stepped aside without being asked. He stopped at the bar, his shadow falling across Eliza like a dark cloud. "Whiskey," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "And information." Hutchins practically tripped over himself to pour the drink. "Of course, Mr. Kane, of course. What kind of information?" "Need someone who can cook and sew." Thomas threw back the whiskey in one smooth motion. "Winter's coming early this year. Snow's already up to my knees in the high passes. I need help putting up stores before the big storms hit." The saloon remained silent. Working for the Mountain Man, in the wilderness, miles from town, with winter closing in, nobody was that desperate. Eliza's stomach growled so loudly she was certain everyone heard it. She looked down at her hands, raw and cracked from washing dishes and scrubbing floors. At the threadbare dress that had once been her mother's, now held together with more patches than original fabric. At the wedding ring on her finger, the only thing of value she had left, though it would barely buy her 3 days of food. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I can cook," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded very small in the cavernous room. "And I can sew." Every eye turned to her. Thomas's gaze found her, and she felt pinned in place by those storm-gray eyes. They traveled over her slowly, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her dress hung on her thin frame, the desperate determination in her face. "You look like a strong wind would blow you away," he said bluntly. "I need someone who can handle hard work, not another mouth to feed." The words stung, but Eliza lifted her chin. "I've been working since dawn every day for the past 2 years, sir. I don't break easy." She twisted the ring off her finger, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "I'll give you this as proof of my commitment. It's gold, real gold. It should be worth—" "Stop." Thomas held up one massive hand. He took 2 steps toward her. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, she could see that they weren't cold at all. There was something haunted in them, something that spoke of old pain carefully locked away. "Gold isn't what I need. I need someone who'll work hard and won't run scared when the wolves start howling at night." He studied her for another long moment, and Eliza felt as if he could see straight through to her bones, to all the desperate hunger and fear she'd been hiding for weeks. "You'll have your own room," he said finally. "I'll pay you fair wages, plus room and board. You'll eat the same food I do, which means you won't go hungry. But the work is hard, and once the snows come, there's no leaving until spring thaw. You understand?" Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. "You got anything you need to get before we leave?" Just my things from the boarding house." "Hutchins," Thomas said, without looking away from Eliza. "You owe this woman wages. Pay her, now." "Now see here." Thomas turned his head slowly toward the saloon owner. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Hutchins went pale, fumbled in his cash box, and slapped several coins on the bar. "That's what I owe her." Thomas picked up the coins, weighed them in his palm, then added more from his own pocket before pressing them all into Eliza's hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, but surprisingly gentle. "Get your things. I'll wait." 20 minutes later, Eliza stood beside the biggest horse she'd ever seen, a massive Percheron stallion that matched its owner in sheer intimidating size. Her worldly possessions fit into a single worn carpet bag. Thomas secured it to his saddle, then offered her his hand. "You've ridden before?" "Not really," Eliza admitted. "You're about to learn." He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, setting her sideways on the saddle before swinging up behind her. One arm came around her waist, solid and secure. "Hold on." They rode out of Red Creek as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Eliza had expected awkward silence, but Thomas surprised her by pointing out landmarks as they traveled. "That lightning-struck pine marks the turnoff to my land," he said, gesturing to a massive tree split down the middle. "The creek runs year-round, never freezes completely, even in the deepest winter. Good fishing." "How long have you lived up here?" Eliza asked, then worried she was being too forward. 8 years. His voice was quiet behind her. "Came back from the war and found I couldn't stand crowds anymore. Too much noise. Too many people wanting things." "The war?" "Gettysburg. Antietam. All of them." He shifted slightly, and she felt the tension in his body. "Lost most of my unit at Shiloh. Came home to find my wife had died of fever while I was gone, And my daughter. He stopped abruptly. Eliza waited, but he didn't continue. She understood. Some pain was too raw to speak of, even years later. They rode in silence as the trail climbed higher into the mountains. The temperature dropped steadily, and Eliza shivered in her thin shawl. Without a word, Thomas stopped the horse and shrugged out of his heavy coat, draping it around her shoulders. It smelled like wood smoke and pine and something wild. "But you'll be cold," she protested. "I've slept in snowdrifts. I'll be fine." He urged the horse forward again. "Tell me about you. How'd you end up in Red Creek?" "My husband brought me here 2 years ago," Eliza said softly. "He'd heard there was gold in the mountains. He was so certain we'd be rich." She twisted her fingers together. "He died 6 months later. Mine collapse. They didn't even recover his body." "And you stayed?" "I had nowhere else to go. My family disowned me when I married James against their wishes. He was a dreamer, not the practical merchant they'd chosen for me." She smiled sadly. They were right in the end. But I loved him anyway. "Love doesn't follow logic," Thomas said quietly. "If it did, it wouldn't hurt so much when it's gone." Full darkness had fallen by the time they reached Thomas's property. Eliza had been fighting to stay awake, the warmth of the coat and the steady rhythm of the horse lulling her into drowsiness. She jerked alert when Thomas pulled the horse to a stop. "We're here." She looked around, seeing nothing but dark shapes of trees and mountains. Then Thomas dismounted and helped her down, and she saw the cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, solidly built from thick logs with a stone chimney. Light glowed in one window. He'd left a lamp burning before he left. "I'll show you inside. Get the fire built up," Thomas said, taking her bag. "You must be exhausted." The cabin's interior was surprisingly clean and well-organized. One large main room served as kitchen and living area, with a loft above that she assumed was his sleeping space. A separate door led to what Thomas explained was a small bedroom he'd built as storage, but never used. "It's not much," he said, setting her bag on the narrow bed, "but it's warm and dry. I'll bring in more firewood for your stove." Eliza looked around the small room, bare wooden walls, a simple bed, a trunk, and a tiny wood stove. To her, it looked like paradise. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Thomas cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Kitchen's got food. Help yourself to whatever you want. I mean it. You eat until you're full. I've got plenty." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Eliza?" "Yes?" "You're not property here. You're not a servant. You're a person, and you'll be treated as one. Anyone asks, you're my employee, nothing more. Your room has a lock, and I give you the only key. You understand?" Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes. She'd been bracing herself for something else, for demands and expectations that came with being a woman alone and desperate. Instead, this mountain of a man was offering her something she'd almost forgotten existed: respect. "I understand," she managed. He nodded once and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Eliza waited until she heard his footsteps recede, then let herself collapse onto the bed. She pulled Thomas's coat tighter around herself, and for the first time in months, felt safe enough to truly sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the small window, and she realized with a start that she'd slept through the entire night without waking once. Quickly, she straightened her dress and hair as best she could and ventured out into the main room. Thomas stood at the stove, his back to her, managing 3 pans at once with surprising dexterity. He'd rolled up his shirt sleeves and she could see the corded muscle in his forearms, the old scars that marked his skin like a map of violence survived. "Morning," he said, without turning around. "Coffee's on the table. Should be strong enough to wake the dead." Eliza poured herself a cup and nearly gasped at the first sip. It was strong, bitter, and absolutely perfect. Thomas plated the food, bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, and set it in front of her before taking his own seat across the small table. "Eat," he said when she hesitated. "All of it. You need your strength back." They ate in comfortable silence. Eliza tried to pace herself, but she was so hungry that she cleaned her plate in minutes. Thomas immediately dished out more. "Today, I'll show you around the property," he said, mopping up egg with his bread. "Storage shed, smokehouse, root cellar. I've got deer meat that needs processing, and the garden needs to be fully harvested before the first hard freeze. You up for it?" "Yes." Eliza straightened her shoulders. "I'm ready to work." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Eliza learned that Thomas hadn't been exaggerating about the amount of work. They were up before dawn every day, working until well after sunset. But it was good, honest work, and she found herself growing stronger. Her hands, which had been soft and weak from her pampered upbringing before James, grew calloused and capable. Thomas was a patient teacher. He showed her how to preserve meat in the smokehouse, how to store root vegetables so they'd last through winter, how to render fat for candles and soap. He taught her to identify edible plants and which berries were safe to eat. In the evenings, while she sewed and mended by lamplight, he'd work on various projects, sharpening tools, repairing leather, carving. They didn't talk much at first, but gradually conversation became easier. Thomas had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and sometimes she'd hear herself laughing at something he said and realize she couldn't remember the last time she'd genuinely laughed before coming here. "You're smiling," Thomas observed one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "You do that now." Eliza touched her face self-consciously. "I suppose I do. I haven't had much to smile about in a long time." "You're looking healthier, too." His gaze was direct but not invasive. "You had me worried that first week. Thought you might collapse." "I almost did," she admitted. "I was down to my last 2 days before. Well, before I would have had to make some very difficult choices." Thomas's jaw tightened. Hutchins would have suggested something, I'm sure. Men like him always do. He did. Eliza stared into the fire. "I told him I'd rather starve. I meant it." "I know you did." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's why I hired you. Not because you were desperate. Anyone can be desperate. But because even desperate, you had lines you wouldn't cross. That takes strength." Their eyes met across the fire, and something shifted in the air between them. Eliza felt her breath catch, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames spreading through her chest. Thomas looked away first, standing abruptly. "I'll bring in more firewood," he muttered, and disappeared into the night. Eliza sat alone by the fire, her heart beating faster than it should. She pressed her hand to her chest, confused by the feeling. She'd loved James, loved him truly. But what she felt when Thomas looked at her was different, more intense, more frightening. She was still sitting there when Thomas returned, his arms loaded with wood. He stopped in the doorway, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. "First snow," he announced. "The big storms will follow soon." He stacked the wood by the hearth, then straightened, brushing off his hands. "Eliza, I need to say something." She stood, nervous at his serious tone. "What is it?" When I brought you here, I thought—" He struggled with the words, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I thought I could keep my distance. Thought I could just have help around the place, and that would be enough." But a crash from outside cut him off. Thomas's head snapped toward the door, every muscle going taut. In one smooth motion, he crossed to the wall and took down his rifle. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice hard and cold. "Lock the door behind me." "What is it?" "Could be a bear getting into the smokehouse. Could be something worse." He checked the rifle's load. "Either way, stay inside." He slipped out into the darkness, and Eliza rushed to lock the door as he'd instructed. She stood with her back pressed against it, listening to her own heartbeat thunder in her ears. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Then she heard voices, Thomas's deep rumble, and another voice, high and aggressive. "I know she's here, Kane. I've been watching your cabin for 3 days." Eliza's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Hutchins. "You got no business on my property," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. "Turn around and ride back to town." "Not without the girl. She owes me money, broke a valuable coffee pot, and she ran out on her room rent at the boarding house. I paid you what you owed her, and you know it. As for the boarding house, that's her business, not yours. She's my business when she steals from me. She didn't steal anything. And you know it." Thomas's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Last chance, Hutchins. Leave. Now." "Or what? You gonna shoot me? Everyone knows you're crazy, Kane. A killer. You think anyone would believe you if—" The sound of a rifle being cocked echoed in the night. "I don't care what anyone believes. Get off my land." There was a long silence. Then, the sound of a horse being spurred into motion. Hoofbeats faded into the distance. Eliza sagged against the door, relief making her weak. Thomas's knock made her jump. "It's me. Let me in." She fumbled with the lock and threw the door open. Thomas stood on the threshold, the rifle still in his hand, his face carved from stone. "He's gone," he said, "but he'll be back. Men like him always come back." He set the rifle aside and looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something raw in his expression. "Eliza, I need to know, did you steal from him?" "No." She wrapped her arms around herself. "The coffee pot slipped from my hands. I was dizzy from hunger. And the boarding house, I was 3 days short on the rent. But I left everything I couldn't carry as payment. Mrs. Henderson knows that." Thomas nodded slowly. "I believe you. But Hutchins, he's going to cause trouble. He's the type to hold a grudge, and he's got enough money to pay men to do his dirty work." "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered. "I've brought danger to your door." "No." Thomas stepped closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him. "He brought danger to my door. There's a difference." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and gently touched her cheek. His palm was rough and warm against her skin. "I'm not going to let him hurt you, Eliza." "Not him, not anyone." "Why?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "Why do you care?" "Because." Thomas's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "Because when I look at you, I see a woman worth protecting, worth everything." Eliza's breath caught. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, she raised her hand and placed it over his where it rested against her face. "Thomas." He pulled back suddenly as if burned. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." He turned away, running his hand through his hair. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He was gone before she could respond, disappearing up into the loft. Eliza stood alone in the main room, her hand pressed to her cheek where his touch had been, her heart racing with a confusing mixture of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next morning was awkward. Thomas was polite but distant, throwing himself into work with an almost desperate intensity. Eliza matched him task for task, determined not to be a burden. They worked in near silence. The easy camaraderie of the previous weeks replaced by a tension that crackled between them like lightning. By mid-afternoon, heavy snow had begun to fall. Thomas came into the cabin stamping his boots, his beard and hair white with snow. "Storm's here," he announced. "A big one. We need to check all the animals are secure and bring in extra firewood. Once this hits in earnest, we might not be able to get to the outbuildings for days." They worked together in the driving snow, making sure the horses were sheltered and fed, that the chickens were locked safely in their coop, that the few goats Thomas kept had plenty of hay. By the time they finished, Eliza was shaking with cold despite her heavy coat and gloves. "Inside, now," Thomas ordered, practically pushing her through the door. "You're frozen through." He built up the fire until it roared, then disappeared into his loft and came back with a heavy quilt. "Strip off those wet things and wrap up in this," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll make hot coffee." Eliza's fingers were so numb she could barely work the buttons of her dress. She managed to get out of the wet outer layers and wrapped herself in the quilt, which smelled like Thomas, wood smoke and pine, and something uniquely him. "I'm decent," she said through chattering teeth. Thomas turned back and frowned at her. "You're still shaking. Come here." He guided her to the chair closest to the fire and wrapped a second blanket around her shoulders. Then he pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands, his own wrapping around hers to steady them. "Drink," he ordered. Slowly, Eliza sipped the scalding liquid, feeling warmth gradually spread through her body. Thomas crouched beside her chair, still holding her hands around the cup, his gray eyes searching her face with concern. "Better?" he asked softly. "Yes, thank you." He should have moved away then. Should have stood up and gone about his business. Instead, he stayed where he was, so close she could see the individual snowflakes melting in his beard, could count the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "Eliza," he said quietly, "about last night." "Don't apologize," she interrupted. "Please don't apologize for being kind to me. It wasn't just kindness," his voice was rough, "and we both know it." Her heart began to pound again. "Then what was it?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if wrestling with himself. Finally, he spoke. "When my daughter died, I swore I'd never care about anyone again. It hurts too much to love and lose. I came up here to the mountains to be alone, to not feel anything for anyone." He looked up at her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "But then you stumbled into the saloon, half-starved and desperate, but still standing tall. And he shook his head. "I can't stop thinking about you, can't stop wanting to make you smile, to see you safe and healthy, and it terrifies me." Eliza set down the coffee cup with trembling hands. Very slowly, she reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheek. "I'm terrified too," she whispered. "When James died, I thought I'd died with him. I was just going through the motions, day after day, not really living. But here, with you." She swallowed hard. "I feel alive again, and that's frightening." Eliza, her name was a prayer on his lips. "I'm not good at this. I'm rough and I'm damaged and I live in the middle of nowhere. I can't offer you a fancy life or— I don't want fancy, she interrupted. I want real. I want honest. I want— She took a shaky breath. I want you. For a heartbeat, Thomas didn't move. Then he surged to his feet, pulling her up with him, the blankets falling away. His hands cupped her face, tilting it up to his. If I kiss you, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I won't want to stop. I won't want to let you go. Then don't, Eliza breathed. His lips met hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a large, rough man. The kiss started soft, tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. But when Eliza pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, he deepened the kiss, one arm wrapping around her waist to pull her against him. She fit against his broad chest as if she'd been made for that exact spot. His heart thundered beneath her palm, matching the racing of her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. You undo me, he whispered, completely. Good, Eliza said, smiling. You undo me too. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, wrapped in Thomas's arms, Eliza had never felt warmer or safer. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being snowbound together, of conversations by the fire that stretched late into the night, of stolen kisses and careful touches that spoke of growing desire tempered with respect. Thomas told her about his childhood on a farm in Virginia, about his mother who taught him to cook and his father who taught him to hunt, about the war that had broken something fundamental in him, and the wife and daughter he'd lost. Her name was Emma, he said quietly one night, staring into the fire. She was only 4, sweetest little thing you ever saw, had my eyes and her mother's smile. His voice cracked slightly. Scarlet fever took them both while I was at Shiloh. By the time I got the letter and made it home, they'd been in the ground for 2 months. Eliza took his hand, threading her fingers through his. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I failed them, he said flatly. I was off fighting a war while they needed me, and I failed them. No, Eliza squeezed his hand. You were doing what you thought was right. You couldn't have known. You can't blame yourself for something that was beyond your control. Can't I? He looked at her, his eyes haunted. I've spent 8 years up here trying to. Then maybe, Eliza said softly, it's time to forgive yourself, to let yourself live again. Thomas brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. You make it seem possible. In turn, Eliza told him about her own family, wealthy merchants, who'd expected her to marry for business advantage, not love. About meeting James at a church social and falling for his dreams and his optimism. About defying her family to run away with him, certain that love would be enough. Was it? Thomas asked. Enough, I mean. While it lasted, yes, Eliza said. We were happy, even when we were poor, even when things were hard. But James, he wasn't made for the harsh realities of the West. He was a dreamer, not a survivor. She looked at Thomas. You're different. You're both. What am I dreaming of? His voice was soft, intimate. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. I think you know. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Brilliant sunshine sparkled off the fresh snow, turning the world into a crystalline wonderland. Thomas and Eliza dug out the cabin, checked on the animals, and gradually worked their way back to their routine. But everything had changed. There was a new ease between them, a domesticity that felt both natural and thrilling. One afternoon, as Eliza was kneading bread dough and Thomas was oiling his traps by the fire. She started humming. It was an old tune her mother had taught her, one she hadn't thought of in years. Thomas looked up, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have a pretty voice," he said. "My mother used to say I sang like a rusty gate," Eliza replied, laughing. "Your mother was wrong." Thomas set aside his work and stood, crossing to where she worked. Flour dusted her arms up to the elbows, and there was a streak of it across her cheek. He brushed it away gently. "You're beautiful when you're happy. You know that?" "Thomas Kane, are you trying to sweet-talk me?" "Is it working?" "Maybe." She tried to sound coy, but couldn't stop smiling. He leaned down and kissed her, long and slow and thorough, until she forgot all about the bread dough and wrapped her flour-covered arms around his neck. When they finally broke apart, he had flour handprints on his shirt. "Now look what you've done," he said, his eyes dancing with amusement. "That's what you get for distracting me from my work." Their laughter filled the cabin, bright and genuine. It was a sound that had been absent from Thomas's home for far too long. But their happiness was not to last unchallenged. 2 weeks after the big storm, Thomas rode down to the trading post that served the scattered homesteads in the area. He needed salt and ammunition, things he couldn't produce himself. Eliza had wanted to come, but he'd insisted she stay behind. "The trail's still treacherous in places," he'd said. "I'll be back before dark." But dark came, and Thomas didn't return. Eliza tried not to worry, telling herself he'd just been delayed. But as full night fell and still there was no sign of him, fear began to gnaw at her. She kept the fire burning bright and the rifle loaded, just as Thomas had taught her. It was near midnight when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. She grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the window, ready to defend the cabin if necessary. But it was Thomas's big Percheron stallion that appeared in the moonlight, moving at an odd, limping gait. Eliza threw open the door, and her heart stopped. Thomas was slumped in the saddle, barely conscious, his shirt dark with blood. "Thomas!" She ran through the snow in her nightgown, not feeling the cold. "Thomas, what happened?" "Ambush," he mumbled, his words slurred. "3 men. Hutchins sent them. I took care of them, but—" He swayed, and Eliza barely caught him as he fell from the saddle. "No, no, no," she gasped, her hands coming away red when she tried to support him. "Stay with me. Thomas, stay with me." He was too heavy for her to carry, but somehow she managed to half-drag, half-walk him into the cabin. She got him onto his bed in the loft, her nightgown and hands slick with his blood. In the lamplight, she could see the wound. A bullet had grazed his left side, leaving a deep, angry furrow. "I need to stop the bleeding," she said, forcing herself to stay calm, even as panic screamed through her. "This is going to hurt." "Already hurts," Thomas managed, trying to smile. Eliza had watched the doctor in Red Creek work on injured miners. She knew the basics. She'd heated water, found clean cloth, and thanked God that the bullet hadn't lodged inside him. The wound needed to be cleaned and stitched. She had needle and thread for sewing, but using it on human flesh? "Do it," Thomas said, reading her hesitation. "I trust you." His trust gave her courage. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, but Thomas still gasped in pain. His hand shot out and grabbed the bed frame, knuckles white. "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. Not your fault." His words were gritted out between clenched teeth. "Keep going." The stitching was the worst part. Each time the needle pierced his skin, Eliza felt it in her own heart. But Thomas never cried out, just breathed hard through the pain. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. "Done," she whispered. "It's done." Thomas's hand found hers, gripping tight. "You did good, real good." His eyes were glazed with pain and exhaustion. "The men, I left them. Didn't kill them, but they won't be coming back. Sent a message. Hutchins will think twice." "Shh," Eliza soothed, brushing sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. "Don't talk. Just rest." "Can't rest." He struggled to focus on her face. "Need to tell you. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you," Eliza said fiercely. "I won't let it." "Stubborn woman," Thomas mumbled, but there was affection in his voice. His eyes started to drift closed. "Thomas!" Eliza shook him gently. "Stay awake. You have to stay awake." "So tired." "I know, but not yet. Talk to me. Tell me about your plans for spring." He forced his eyes open. "Spring?" "Yes. What are you going to do in the spring?" "Going to build you a bigger room," he said slowly, "with a real window and a proper wardrobe for your dresses." His hand tightened on hers. "Going to plant those wildflowers you like by the cabin. Make it a real home." "It already is a home," Eliza said, tears flowing freely now. "Because you're in it." Thomas's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Eliza, I love you. Should have said it before. Should have—" "I love you too," she interrupted, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "I love you, Thomas Kane. So you have to be okay. You have to be." "Always thought my heart was stone," he whispered. "Then you touched it, and everything changed." His strength could bend steel, but one touch from me made his heart yield. Eliza murmured, remembering something her mother used to say about her father. "Yeah," Thomas said softly, "just like that." His eyes closed again, but this time his breathing was deeper, steadier. He'd fallen into genuine sleep. Eliza stayed beside him all night, checking his bandages, monitoring his fever, refusing to leave his side. She dozed occasionally in the chair beside his bed, but any change in his breathing brought her instantly awake. Dawn found her exhausted, but hopeful. Thomas's color was better, and when she checked his wound, there was no sign of infection. She was changing his bandages when his eyes opened, clearer now, and focused on her face. "Angel," he murmured. "My angel." "Just me," Eliza said, trying to smile through her tears. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot." He tried to sit up and gasped. "Okay, bad idea. Stay still." She pressed him gently back down. "You lost a lot of blood. You need to rest and let yourself heal." "Yes, ma'am." He caught her hand. "Eliza, what I said last night?" "You said you loved me." Her voice was steady. "Did you mean it?" "Every word." His gray eyes were intense on hers. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks. But I meant what I said. I love you." "Then you should know," Eliza said, bringing his hand to her lips, "that I meant it too. I love you, Thomas. With everything I am. Marry me." The words tumbled out, urgent and unplanned. "I know I'm asking at the worst possible time, and I've got nothing to offer you but a mountain cabin and a rough life. But, yes," Eliza didn't let him finish. "Yes, I'll marry you." "Yes?" He looked stunned, as if he'd expected her to refuse. "Did you think I'd say no?" She laughed through her tears. You saved me, Thomas. In every way a person can be saved. You gave me food when I was starving, shelter when I was homeless, and hope when I thought I had none left. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive. Of course, I'll marry you. Thomas pulled her down to him, ignoring the pain in his side, and kissed her with all the pent-up emotion of the terrifying night they'd just survived. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I'm going to spend the rest of my life, he said quietly, making sure you never regret this. I won't. Eliza settled beside him, her head on his shoulder. I already know I won't. Thomas healed slowly but steadily over the next 2 weeks. Eliza proved to be a devoted nurse, managing both the household work and his care with quiet efficiency. As his strength returned, Thomas began to plan. We'll go down to Red Creek as soon as the trails are clear, he said one evening as they sat by the fire. He was finally able to leave his bed for a few hours at a time. Find the circuit preacher and make this official. What about Hutchins? Eliza asked, worried. He'll still be there. Let him be. Thomas's voice was hard. The men he sent are nursing broken bones and won't be eager to try again. And I sent word through the trading post about what happened. Hutchins won't risk his reputation by coming after you now. Too many people know. You sent word? When? Same day I got back. Pete from the trading post rode down with the story. Hutchins might be wealthy, but attempted murder doesn't sit well with folks, even on the frontier. Eliza leaned against his shoulder. You think of everything. I think of keeping you safe, he corrected. That's all that matters. 3 weeks later, strong enough to ride again, they made the journey to Red Creek. The town looked different to Eliza now, smaller, less threatening. She rode in front of Thomas on the big Percheron, his arms secure around her, and felt like she could face anything. The circuit preacher was in town, much to their relief. Reverend Morrison was an elderly man with kind eyes who'd been traveling the frontier for 40 years. He listened to their story, then smiled broadly. It's always a pleasure to marry people who actually love each other, he said. When would you like the ceremony? Now, Thomas said immediately. Right now, if possible. The Reverend laughed. Impatient, are we? Very well. Let me gather a few witnesses. Can't have a proper wedding without witnesses. The ceremony took place in the small church on the edge of town. The witnesses were Pete from the trading post, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who cried happily and apologized to Eliza for ever doubting her about the rent, and surprisingly, several other townspeople who'd heard what happened and wanted to show their support. Eliza wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had pressed for her. Thomas had trimmed his beard and wore his cleanest shirt. They might not have had rings or fancy clothes, but when they stood together before the Reverend, hands clasped and eyes locked, it felt more real and true than any elaborate ceremony could have been. Do you, Thomas Kane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Reverend Morrison asked. I do, Thomas said clearly, his voice strong and certain. For better or worse, in plenty and in want, until death parts us. And do you, Eliza James, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. I truly do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. The Reverend beamed. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Kane. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Eliza into his arms and kissed her soundly, to the cheers and applause of their small audience. When they broke apart, both were grinning like fools. As they left the church, Eliza saw Hutchins watching from across the street. His face was twisted with anger, but when Thomas met his gaze steadily, the older man looked away first and disappeared into the saloon. "He's done," Pete said quietly, coming up beside them. "Word got around about what he tried to do. Half his business has dried up. People don't like bullies, even rich ones." "Good," Thomas said flatly. Then his expression softened as he looked down at his new wife. "Come on, Mrs. Kane. Let's go home." The ride back to the cabin seemed shorter than usual. Or maybe it was just that Eliza was so happy she barely noticed the distance. When they arrived, Thomas insisted on carrying her over the threshold, despite her protests about his still healing wound. "It's tradition," he said, sweeping her into his arms. "And I'm not about to start our marriage by breaking tradition." He carried her inside and set her gently on her feet in the middle of the main room. The fire was already burning. They'd left it banked that morning, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas took both her hands in his expression suddenly serious. "Eliza Kane," he said softly, testing out her new name. "I need you to know something. I'm not an easy man. I've got scars, inside and out. I can be moody and difficult. Living up here, isolated for months at a time, it's hard. It's lonely. And there will be times when you'll wonder what you've gotten yourself into." "Thomas, let me finish." He squeezed her hands. "But I swear to you, I will spend every day of our marriage trying to make you happy. I'll keep you warm in winter and safe from harm. I'll listen when you need to talk and give you space when you need to think. I'll love you with everything I have for as long as I live." His voice grew rough with emotion. "You saved my life, Eliza. Not just that night when you patched me up, but long before that. You reminded me what it felt like to be human again, to care about someone, to hope." Eliza felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You saved mine too," she whispered. "In every way that matters. You looked at me when I was at my lowest and saw someone worth saving. You treated me with respect when I had nothing. You gave me a reason to keep going." She reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands. "I'm not afraid of the isolation or the hard work. I'm not afraid of your scars or your moods. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing you." "You won't," Thomas promised. "Not if I can help it." He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. When he lifted her in his arms and carried her up to the loft, she went willingly, joyfully, into their new life together. The winter that followed was the happiest Eliza had ever known. She and Thomas fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and sitting by the fire in the evenings, talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's company. Thomas taught her to shoot, and she turned out to be a surprisingly good marksman. In turn, she taught him to bake proper bread and pies, laughing at his frustration when the dough wouldn't cooperate. One snowy afternoon in late January, as Eliza was mending one of Thomas's shirts, she heard a commotion outside. Thomas had been checking the traps, but he burst through the door with excitement written all over his face. "Come here," he said, grabbing her hand. "You have to see this." "See what?" "Thomas, it's freezing outside." "Just trust me." He wrapped her in her coat and pulled her outside. There, in the clearing, in front of the cabin, was a doe and her fawn. They stood perfectly still in the falling snow, watching the humans with liquid dark eyes. The fawn couldn't have been more than a few months old, still spotted with its baby coat. "They're beautiful," Eliza breathed, afraid to move and spook them. "The doe's been denning near here all winter," Thomas said softly. "She's not afraid of me anymore. I've been leaving her hay when the snow gets too deep." He looked at Eliza, his eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I wanted you to see them, wanted to share this with you." They stood together in the snow, arms around each other, watching the deer until they finally wandered off into the trees. Thomas turned Eliza to face him, brushing snowflakes from her hair. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "Happiness, a home, someone to share it with." He pressed his forehead against hers. "You gave that back to me, Eliza. You gave me everything." "We gave it to each other," she corrected. "That's what makes it so precious." As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Thomas kept his promise about building Eliza a bigger room. He also built a proper bed frame to replace her narrow cot, carved with mountain wildflowers along the headboard. When she protested that it was too much work, he just smiled. "Nothing's too much work for you," he said simply. In April, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He was silent for so long that she began to worry, but when she looked at his face, she saw tears streaming down into his beard. "Thomas, a baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said roughly. "I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful, and," he laughed shakily, "I'm everything all at once." "I'm scared too," Eliza admitted. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if—" "You'll be perfect," Thomas interrupted. "I already know it." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This child is going to be so loved, Eliza. So very loved." As the months passed and Eliza's belly grew, Thomas became even more protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest every afternoon, and hovered so constantly that she finally had to shoo him away. "I'm pregnant, not made of porcelain," she laughed one day when he tried to prevent her from kneading bread. "I can still work, Thomas. I know, but oh," he looked helpless. "I lost Emma and Margaret because I wasn't there. I can't lose you. I can't." Eliza took his hands and placed them on her rounded stomach. "Feel that? The baby's kicking. Strong kicks, like he or she is already impatient to meet us." She looked up at him seriously. "I'm not going anywhere, Thomas. We're going to be fine, all three of us." He kissed her gently. "Promise?" "Promise." One afternoon in late September, Eliza went into the small general store that had opened in Red Creek and heard familiar laughter. She turned to see two women gossiping by the dry goods counter. One of them was a waitress from the saloon who'd always looked down on her when she worked there. "Did you hear about the mountain man?" the waitress was saying to her friend. "Finally got himself a wife. Brought her down from his cabin last spring." "I heard she trapped him," the friend replied. "Seduced him for security." The waitress laughed. More like he felt sorry for her. She was half-starved when he took her in. But now, she lowered her voice conspiratorially. Now she walks around like she owns the place. "His strength could bend steel, but one touch from me made his heart yield," she quoted mockingly. That's what she said once. Can you believe it? As if someone like her could actually could what? Both women spun around to find Eliza standing behind them. Thomas was visible through the store window, talking with the shopkeeper about ammunition. Eliza had filled out in the months since they'd married, her face healthy and glowing, her pregnancy evident but not yet cumbersome. The waitress flushed red. "Mrs. Kane, I didn't see you there." Clearly. Eliza's voice was cool. "Let me tell you something about my husband. Thomas Kane is the strongest, bravest, most honorable man I've ever known. He doesn't bend steel. He protects those who need protecting. And yes, his heart was hard when I met him, hardened by loss and pain. But it wasn't my touch that changed him." She placed her hand on her stomach. It was his own courage in choosing to love again, despite the risk, in choosing hope over despair. That's the kind of man he is. The waitress couldn't meet her eyes. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did." Eliza softened slightly. "But I understand. It's easier to mock what you don't understand than to see the truth of it. Thomas and I saved each other. That's our story. And honestly, I don't care what anyone in this town thinks about it." She turned and walked out, head held high. Thomas was waiting by the wagon, and his eyes immediately found hers, reading her mood with the ease of long familiarity. "What happened?" he asked, helping her up onto the seat. Eliza told him as they drove out of town. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment, then started to laugh. "What's funny?" she demanded. "You," he said, still chuckling. "Standing up to gossips, defending my honor." He squeezed her hand. "My fierce wife." "She said I trapped you," Eliza said indignantly. "As if you could be trapped by anyone." Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Eliza Kane, you did trap me. From the moment you walked into that saloon with your chin up despite your circumstances, I was caught, and I've never wanted to be free." He kissed her softly. "Let them talk. It doesn't change what we have." "You're right," Eliza said, feeling the baby kick strongly as if in agreement. "It doesn't change anything at all." Their daughter was born in December, during the first big snowstorm of winter. Thomas delivered the baby himself, with steady hands and a calm voice, though Eliza could see the fear in his eyes. When the baby girl's first cry filled the cabin, Thomas sat down hard on the floor, overcome with emotion. "She's perfect," Eliza said, holding the tiny bundle. "Thomas, she's perfect." He crawled to the bedside, his face wet with tears, and gently touched one finger to his daughter's tiny hand. She immediately gripped it, her miniature fingers wrapping around his massive one. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa. I'm going to love you and protect you for as long as I live." They named her Hope Margaret Kane. Margaret for Thomas's first daughter, Hope for what this child represented. As Thomas held his new daughter for the first time, cradling her carefully in his large hands, Eliza saw 8 years of grief and pain finally begin to heal. "Thank you," he said softly, not looking away from Hope's tiny face. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family again." "We're in this together," Eliza reminded him, echoing words he'd said to her months ago. "Together." "Together," he agreed. As spring arrived once more and the snow melted from the mountains, Eliza often found herself standing on the cabin's porch, Hope in her arms, watching Thomas work in the garden he'd expanded. Sometimes she still couldn't quite believe this was her life, that she'd found love and safety and happiness in the wilderness, with a man the world had called dangerous and broken. One warm May afternoon, Thomas came in from working and found Eliza sitting in the rocking chair he'd built for her, nursing Hope and humming. He stopped in the doorway, just watching them, a smile playing at his lips. "What?" Eliza asked, noticing his gaze. "Just thinking," he said, coming to kneel beside the chair. He stroked Hope's downy dark hair, then looked up at Eliza, about how close I came to missing all of this. If I hadn't gone to town that day, if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up, if either of us had been too scared to take a chance. But we did, Eliza said firmly. We took the chance. We chose each other. And look what we built. Thomas stood and pulled her gently to her feet, careful not to disturb the nursing baby. He wrapped his arms around both his wife and daughter, holding them close. I love you, he said simply. Both of you, more than words can say. We love you too, Eliza replied, leaning into his embrace. Always. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. Where once a lonely man had hidden from the world, now a family thrived. Where once survival had been the only goal, now there was love, laughter, and hope. And on warm summer evenings, when neighbors from the scattered homesteads came to visit, they'd sometimes hear Eliza telling Hope the story of how her parents met. And she'd always include the part about the hard-hearted mountain man who thought he'd never love again, and the desperate woman who thought she'd never be safe, about how they'd found each other at exactly the right moment when both needed saving. His strength could bend steel, Eliza would say, bouncing Hope on her knee. But one touch from me made his heart yield. And she'd look at Thomas across the room, and he'd look back at her, and they'd both smile, because they knew it was true. They'd saved each other, healed each other, and built something beautiful together. And that, more than any tale of gunslingers or gold rushes, was the real story of the American West. People finding home in each other, building families in the wilderness, and proving that love, when it's real and true, can survive anything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Thomas and Eliza's journey? Your feedback means the world to us.